Oh, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to correct some of my slightly mistaken predictions. So I will start with what I wrote in an article in the Weekly Worker on the 22nd of April, first of all. I'm referring to two previous articles that I wrote. The one I just referred to was about the outcome of the fourth inconclusive elections in Israel in the last 2 years. I mean, there were four elections that were called by Netanyahu simply as a way of trying to form a coalition that will give him immunity from his being prosecuted. He's actually currently being prosecuted by the Israeli courts for corruption and bribery. He would like to legislate himself out of it. 4 elections didn't give him the result he wanted. The fourth one in March this year was inconclusive. He and his party and the parties committed to supporting him did not get a majority, nor did the parties committed to prevent him being prime minister. So it's inconclusive. And one of the things that he could do, as I predicted then, I'm quoting from that article, what can Netanyahu present as an excuse for a national emergency, which would give him a pretext for forming maybe a national coalition? How about war? You may have noticed that the tension between Israel and Iran has been hotting up. Hostilities have escalated. Israeli commentators have not failed to note that this is something to do with the election result. So everything pointed towards a provocation, a warlike provocation, but I was pointing in the wrong direction along with other commentators. The prediction was that he would make a provocation towards Iran. And indeed, there were signs of course, a series of assassinations and provocations against actual provocations against Iranian shipping in the Mediterranean and in the Gulf. But this was pointing in the fourth direction. So what was actually clear was that Netanyahu was interested in manufacturing a national crisis. Did he actually intend to provoke that crisis, which happened not in the Iranian front, but in Jerusalem? Was it manufactured by him, or did he just opportunistically exploit an opportunity that just happened? Well, there is some evidence that it was provoked. And what is the evidence? Now, in an article that I published in the Weekly Worker on the 13th of May, that is to say, after the crisis in Jerusalem actually started, but although it was published on the 13th after the explosion with Gaza, it was written before Gaza became involved. And so the question was, did he provoke the crisis, the heating of the hostilities in Jerusalem? I pointed in that article at the three components that made up this explosion in Jerusalem. I said, like gunpowder, there are three components that mixed together produce an explosive product. Well, two of them he didn't and couldn't control. They just happened anyway. I mean, he didn't fix the date of Ramadan. Ramadan was going to happen on that date, and as you know, Ramadan is not fixed in season because it is celebrated by a lunar calendar, so that it shifts around the year. And this year it just happened to be between the 12th of April and 12th of May, according to the lunar calendar. This, of course, he didn't control. He didn't control the timetable of the ethnic cleansing move in Sheikh Jarrah, because that was fixed by the timetable of the court that was going to hand out a verdict, probably supporting the settlers who were plotting, were going to evict some families long settled in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which was one contributing factor. But one thing was a provocation that happened according to his instruction, most probably. And that is the decision by the Minister of Public Security, Amir Ohana, who is a loyalist, servant of Netanyahu. He gave an order to close the plaza outside the northern gate of the walled city of Jerusalem, Bab el-Amud, which was unprecedented. It wasn't something that happened every year during Ramadan. And it was undoubtedly a provocative act. This happened on the 18th of April. As people go out of the prayers from the holy compound of Al-Aqsa and move out of the walled city towards some Palestinian neighborhoods outside the walled city, they normally gather for a while before the iftar, before the meal that breaks the fast of Ramadan. They gather peacefully in this plaza outside Bab el-Amud, which is known in the West as Damascus Gate, the northern gate of the old city. This is by the way, the only place, only open plaza in the Muslim part of Jerusalem where people can gather peacefully. He closed it down, and moreover, he ordered some buses of worshippers coming from inside the Green Line in pre-1967 Israel, who come to join the prayer. He ordered to stop them and compel these worshippers to travel, some of them old people and disabled, to walk a fair length of way into the walled city in order to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was a design provocation, and that escalated the whole situation and exploded the whole situation in Al-Aqsa. He then relented and ordered Ohana, no doubt acting under the orders of Netanyahu, ordered the gates, the barriers that he had positioned there to be removed, but he made very aggressive moves against the crowds gathering there anyway. So this was a calculated provocation. Things escalated from there. Did he intend for the crisis to encompass Gaza as well? Did he engineer the onslaught on Gaza? Probably not. This was part of unintended consequences of which I actually hinted at in the first article I was referring to. I said, he may start a crisis, but one doesn't know how far it will go. He may not intend it to go towards a full-scale war, but things can get out of it. And in this case, they got out of hand due to a miscalculation of the Netanyahu and the Israeli military. They simply did not factor in the possibility that Hamas would involve itself in the crisis. They believed their own propaganda. Their assessment was that the leadership of Hamas had been weakened and deterred by the previous major Israeli incursion into Gaza, a major assault, which lasted several weeks, and that was 7 years ago, in 2014. It was a major, if you remember, major Israeli incursion into Gaza, which resulted in thousands of casualties for the Palestinian people. The Israeli planners and Netanyahu himself believed, for example, that the leader of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, had undergone some process of moderation, quote unquote, that he is not going to intervene in this crisis. They also did not count on the development of a huge number of rockets, some of them improved compared to what Hamas had used before. And so this came as a surprise. The intervention of Hamas started on the 10th of May. They issued an ultimatum: take your bloody police out of the holy compound, or we will intervene in this war, we'll start shooting our rockets. Okay, they did not plan for this, and the Israeli response came maybe as a welcome opportunity for Netanyahu, but not as a planned one. The war with Gaza was not something that he planned. I don't want to go into the description of the events vis-a-vis Gaza, because I'm sure people have watched it. It was prominently accounted and described in the various news media. By the way, this was a change, and I will go back to in a moment to the change in the attitude, or certain change in the attitude of the media towards this conflict. But anyway, I want to sum up. I don't want to go on for too long. I would like to, in this opening talk, I would like to just sum up the consequences of this assault Israeli. So that, calling it a war is, I think, a misnomer. It was mainly a one-sided assault by the vast, mighty Israeli army, mainly Air Force, artillery, and Navy, bombarding the people of Gaza in a brutal, most brutal way, typical of a colonial army, and the partly ineffective rockets fired by Hamas, most of which were actually disabled by the Israeli defense mechanism, or the setup known as the Iron Dome. Only, probably only about 10% of the vast number of rockets fired by Hamas actually hit anywhere in Israel, but they were more effective relatively, and longer range than Israel had calculated, and certainly than Hamas had available in previous conflicts. Okay, I would like to sum up the consequences. That, first of all, who won this assault? Certainly, Israel didn't win it. I mean, if anything, the winners of this 11 years assault were Hamas, and, by the way, the Egyptian regime. This is not widely noticed. I don't think that the British media, for example, tell you how Egypt won. And let me just cover this briefly. Biden did not count on talking at all to al-Sisi, to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, anytime soon. But he needed his services in order to arrange a ceasefire. So contrary to his plan, he had to, as it were, change his timetable and attitude towards Egypt. And Egypt now is positioned as the controller of the truth. It is the local power that is able to talk to both sides. It has both friendly relations with the Netanyahu regime and with Hamas in Gaza. Not so friendly, but anyway, they talk to each other. And so through Egypt, the whole ceasefire was arranged. But Hamas had won quite a few, at least on points, quite a few things out of this war. Israel has not achieved any aim because it didn't have any planned aim. It was just reacting to something that was unexpected to it. So first of all, Hamas caught Israel by surprise. This was one element that it achieved. Or before that, I should go back and say that Netanyahu certainly achieved personally achievements out of this conflict, and that is he certainly was able to prevent the formation of a counter coalition that would form a government against him. But whether it will actually help him to form his coalition after all, to seduce some of his opponents to join him and form a majority in the Knesset, this remains to be seen. The betting now, as it was in April when I wrote about these things, is that Israel is going to have a fifth election very shortly. And Netanyahu is likely to win that fifth election, but we shall see. But Israel has lost quite a lot. First of all, the conflict has caused a unification of the Palestinian masses. For the first time, the Palestinian masses, both within the Green Line, that is to say, the area under Israeli rule until 1967, plus the Palestinians in Gaza, plus the Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have risen together against their colonial oppressor. That is something that I don't think that Benjamin Netanyahu and his advisors expected. Most people didn't expect it. It came as a surprise, and this is a major change in the situation in the area under Israeli rule. For example, on the 18th of May, the Palestinian Arab population of Israel, those who are citizens of Israel, they declared a general strike. Their semi-official leadership, known as the follow-up committee, which is as a committee of civic leaders, local mayors and others, local leaders of the Palestinian population within Israel. It declared a general strike on Tuesday, the 18th of May, and this was quite successful. In other words, participation was very high. A lot of Israeli commentators bewail the breakdown of coexistence, which apparently existed between the Hebrew majority and the Palestinian Arab 20% minority in Israel, as if there was a coexistence. And it needed several commentators, both of the Israeli more radical left and the Palestinian population itself, to point out, what are you talking about? What coexistence? We were just suffering quietly, more or less, a severe discrimination and the effects of the policy of Jewish supremacy, the colonialist regime of Israel inside its older border. This is now just coming out. This was the sort of last straw that broke the camel back. Now we are out in solidarity with our sisters and brothers across the Green Line and in Gaza. So this is one outcome, which is a loss for the Israeli leadership. Another very noticeable shift is the shift in public opinion. This was reflected in the way the press commented on it. If you read The Guardian or you listen to the BBC, you may have noticed a certain change in tone. This is really a response to something that comes from across the ocean, from the United States, where public opinion, especially among the, let us say, more liberal part of the United States opinion, especially among younger people, including very prominently among the Jewish population, things that come out of there which were are more or less unprecedented. Expressions of dismay about Israel, a growing, visible growing of the rift between a major part of Jewish opinion in the United States and Israel. This has found certain reflection, if you like, in the media over here. I mean, if you follow what the Guardian has written, there have been certain unprecedented expressions of dismay about the policy and the behavior of the colonialist regime in Israel. Notably, Friedland, Jonathan Friedland, who is the Zionist gatekeeper of this paper, The Guardian, came out in a remarkable article in which he lashes against the policy of the Israeli government. And to some extent, I mean, criticizes his own previous position of unqualified support for the Israeli regime. This is new. Whether it is going to last is another question, but I think that Biden cannot help but being to some extent responsive to the change among his own followers in the United States. There is a shift which opinion polls reflect quite clearly among the followers, especially the younger section of the followers, especially the more liberal followers of the Democratic Party. This has not failed to influence him. Although he initially publicly repeated the old mantra of, Israel has a right to defend itself, as though Israel is the attacked party in the entire conflict, not the colonial oppressor. Well, you'd expect this from an American president. After all, in the American Declaration of Independence, they refer to their own colonial victims, the indigenous, the original Americans, the Native Americans. You know how they refer to them. They call them, they complain to King George III that he's not protecting them from the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. Well, now I think many Americans blush to read this part in the American Declaration of Independence. But of course, there is a clear and direct analogy between these, quote, merciless Indian savages on their frontiers and the, quote, merciless Palestinian savages across Israel frontiers. So you'd expect an American president to repeat this nonsense, echoing the American Declaration of Independence. Well, be that as it may. But in reality, he became angrier and angrier in his several phone calls to Netanyahu, and finally compelled him to accept a ceasefire. Okay, well, this is the outcome of the war so far. It has not solved anything. It has not given Israel any advantage except possibly a personal advantage to Netanyahu. It has left things as they are. Israel has wreaked havoc in Gaza, has brutally destroyed a lot of dwellings, killed many people. The final number of casualties is still to be reckoned because there may be a lot of dead people under the ruins. But achieved next to nothing as a result, not even as in terms of deterrence. What else can I say? This conflict, this crisis will go on and on because things, even within Israel, have been hotting up. The crisis around the holy places in Jerusalem has not ended. There's still clashes there, the police brutality against worshippers, and so on and so on. So this is where we stand now. I cannot end this opening talk without saying a few words about Hamas. I think, of course, there is no symmetry between Hamas and the Israeli regime. On one side, we have the oppressive Zionist colonizing regime, fired by messianic racism and imposing colonial Jewish supremacy. On the other hand, on the other side, we have a movement of resistance, but we have to say it is a reactionary resistance movement. We cannot avoid, and we shouldn't avoid pointing out that it is a reactionary movement, keeping 2 million Palestinians under a theocratic, misogynistic, dictatorial repression. That is a fact. I'm not being critical of Hamas as a terrorist organization. If anything, the terrorist in this drama is Israel, an extremely terroristic state, which applies massive assassination and destruction against civilian population. No, I mean I'm referring to it not as a terroristic organization, which is an arbitrary epithet used against people you don't like. It is simply a reactionary organization, although, again, there is no symmetry. Israel is a ruthless nuclear power. It is a danger to the whole world, which you cannot say about Hamas. But you can point out that Hamas played a cynical political game. Its intervention in the crisis that emerged in Jerusalem had the consequence of preempting a truly popular struggle which was beginning to emerge, similar to the First Intifada in 1987, and similar to the popular surge that you may remember from about this time 3 years ago, in May of 2018, where people, for the popular masses of Gaza, went near and demonstrated and near the walls of their cage, the walls of the cage, which cages them in this large concentration camp called the Gaza Strip. It preempted action from on behalf of the masses in Gaza, and it did this in order to gain an advantage in the inter-factional conflict between Palestinian factions. You see, the Palestinian Arab people have, especially the parts under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, have two terrible leaderships. One is the quisling collaborationist leadership of the so-called Palestinian Authority, which is no, I mean, this is an ironic name because there is no authority at all. It is serving as an arm of the Israeli oppressive regime. And on the other hand, you have Hamas an offshoot of the Muslim Brothers, a reactionary, oppressive leadership, and they vie for primacy. Hamas has indeed managed through this intervention to gain an advantage vis-a-vis its rivals in Ramallah, the PLO-led so-called Palestinian Authority. I may also add that there is a synergy that people may not realize, that actually there is an objective collusion between the Israeli regime and Hamas. This has been pointed out by several commentators. I'm not revealing any secret, although very few people in the Western media have pointed it out. The only exception that I saw recently was an article by Adam Schatz in the London Review of Books. He actually mentions the objective and, in fact, unofficial synergy between the Israeli regime and Hamas. First of all, it is a fact that Hamas is subsidized by the Qatar regime. It gets several hundreds of millions of dollars every year from Qatar, but it gets them through Israel. That is to say, Netanyahu has to authorize the transfer of funds from Qatar to the Gaza Strip. Most of it goes to under the control of Hamas. So he wouldn't do it if he didn't want Hamas to stay in power, weakened perhaps, but stay in power in Gaza. In fact, he actually said so, and I'm quoting from this is, I'm afraid I have to translate from the Hebrew because I haven't found an English translation, but from a report in the Hebrew press. It goes back 2 years ago to March 2019. In a meeting of the Likud faction in the Israeli parliament, at the beginning of March 2019, the Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about this issue expansively, and he remarked, quote, "Whoever wants to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state must support the strengthening of Hamas and the transfer of money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to split between the Palestinians in Gaza and those in Judea and Samaria, which means the West Bank in Israeli parlance." So he was actually, to his own supporters in a closed meeting, which was then reported, admitted that he is actually in favor of keeping Hamas in power, weakened, but in power. Why? First of all, what is the alternative? Who is going to run Hamas? Egypt is not going to take it over. It's a hot potato that Egypt is not going to take. Israel itself, it is too costly for Israel to directly control the Gaza Strip. It is very happy with the situation where the Palestinian people is split and separated into cantons, mutually rival cantons. It serves Israel's interest to keep Hamas in power in Gaza. Let me also add that the actual victims of Hamas rocket included, I mean, there were 10, I believe 10 Israeli people in Israel, not Israeli, 10 people in Israel killed as a result of the Hamas onslaught. These included 2 Thai agricultural workers who were not aware of the alarm because it was not broadcast in their language. It was only broadcast in Hebrew. So there were 2 Thai agricultural workers who got killed among these 10 people. and another victim was an Indian caretaker, and one homeless, disabled Israeli Jew, sleeping rough, so he couldn't get to a shelter. And that is, that is part of the toll, the victims of Hamas rockets. So in summary, what do socialists, what should socialists raise as a demand? First of all, there is a difference between demands that you raise and solutions that you offer seriously as an outcome for this long-lasting colonial conflict. So the first demand must be end Israel military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and don't forget the Golan Heights, which is also occupied by Israel illegally. End this occupation. In the territory under Israeli control, equal rights, individual rights and national rights to all the inhabitants of this area. Demand the right of return of the Palestinian refugees and their descendants to their homeland. The long-term aim should be overthrow of the Zionist regime and the existing Arab regimes by their working classes for a unified socialist Arab East. This is not going to happen tomorrow, but this is the long-term aim that the socialists should aim for. I think I've spoken long enough.
Thank you, Moshé. Yeah, that's a good introduction. We had 45 minutes there, or 40 minutes really. Yassamine wants to speak for 20 minutes or so, as you wish.
Okay. You might ask, what's Iran's connection to the events that have happened currently? But as Moshé pointed out, for weeks now, I would say since January in particular, we had witnessed a proxy war, or some called it a Cold War, between Iran and Israel. And I don't think Moshé should apologize for what he'd written, because the expectation was that the Israelis were keen on a war with Iran. Netanyahu wanted this to survive. But also, I think in addition to Netanyahu's personal aims, there was the fear of what might happen in Vienna. And for Israel, that was not something they were going to accept. The deal, the return of the United States after Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and the fact that Biden had started these discussions. In fact, if you followed some of the posts that Moshé sent, but also in general what some newspapers in Israel were saying, Netanyahu was being a bit isolated. Bin Salman, the other enemy of Iran and close ally of Trump, had actually started peace talks, friendly talks, brotherly talks with the wonderful Iran's Islamic Republic. But Netanyahu was a bit left out of all this. And I saw, for example, an article just before the Gaza events in Haaretz saying exactly that Israel is losing out because, unlike Bin Salman, the penny hasn't dropped that there is a change in the White House, and you have to change your tactics regarding the Vienna talks. But Israel is adamant that it will do what it can to stop the return of Iran into the world economic environment, and it's legitimizing Iran's Islamic Republic. So in a way, the two are the issues are quite entangled. But despite all the initiatives taken by Netanyahu, such as killing a nuclear physicist who was associated with the Revolutionary Guards in the middle of Tehran, and then almost shouting about it, claiming that Mossad did this, in the case of Fakhrizadeh, or a number of attacks on Iranian shipping, and then an attack on Natanz nuclear plant. Iran didn't go there. And that's because people like Netanyahu, or before him, Trump, when he was in power, constantly underestimate the clerics in Tehran. They are not stupid. They don't go to war when it's not in their interest, and they didn't fall into the trap. And in some ways, it was inevitable that the conflict would maybe move on, go to another level, go to something else. And that's what we saw. Now, I think when we look at long-term solutions in terms of what will happen between between Israel and the Palestinians, the issue of international solidarity is very important. And if we consider that, regional solidarity is even more important. That regional solidarity takes the form of how the peoples of the region can defend the Palestinian population, many of whom are in exile, 2 million of whom are incarcerated in Gaza. The others are under the rule of a corrupt Fatah government. So, unless you look at this in a regional context, you can't really find many solutions. And again, here, Iran would be significant because of its position in Lebanon with Hezbollah, because of its position in Iraq, because of its current involvement in Syria. And that is why we really have to deal with this phenomena, Iran's Islamic Republic. And unfortunately, the record of that government is worse than Hamas. I mean, you could say, Hamas might come out head and shoulders above Iran's Islamic Republic. Why is that? And why we really have to take on this issue of Iran's Islamic Republic? Well, first of all, let me tell you that historically, for the Iranian left and for many nationalists even in Iran, the question of Palestine was very important, was in the forefront of their solidarity. The generation of opposition leaders before the Shah's downfall were people who actually went and fought in Palestine. Comrades that some of you might know, such as Shalbuni, started their political activity in what was in Iran called the Palestine Group. It was that important to Iranian leftists. And now we are in a situation when Iran was probably the only country in the Middle East where there was no mass protests during the last 2 weeks. The protests we have heard in Iran are in fact quite the opposite, not the last 2 weeks, but in general, when young people protest in Iran, when there are demonstrations, they say, leave Palestine alone, deal with our problems. Now, that in itself is also false because Iran's Islamic Republic isn't doing much about Palestine anyway. But the notion put forward by the Trumpists, by the royalists, by the right wing, has constantly been equating Hamas with Iran's Islamic Republic. And this false information has, if you like, this is complete fiction, but this fiction has been repeated so much by the right-wing press, by the Israeli press, by the TV stations paid by Israel, United States, and Saudi Arabia, that a lot of people actually believe it. The Islamic Republic's original relations were with Fatah. But those fell through because when the Iran-Iraq war started, most of the Arab governments and the PLO and Fatah actually took the side of the Arab Saddam Hussein. I think that was probably inevitable. Some Iranians have told me that was actually one of the reasons why Iran fell into the trap of Iran Gate, where it actually had some close relations with Israel. But that put aside, since then, Iran has had a very tumultuous relationship with Hamas. Tumultuous in that at times it's been very good relations. At times it's been, at least on the level of propaganda, quite good relations. At times it's been almost at the level of fighting each other. On Syria, they disagreed. On Iraq, they disagreed. On many issues, they have not been on the same side. It is true that Qatar, as the main backer of Hamas, is not in the same position as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia with Iran. But on the other hand, you couldn't say that Qatar is Iran's best ally either. So you have to see it in that context. So in that way, I certainly want to dismantle this argument put forward mainly by the right wing, but repeated now because media is an echo chamber, in my opinion, repeated by all sorts of people. But Iran's main ally in Palestine and in Gaza is Jihad Islami, and that's a different organization. It has a different setup. It coexists with Hamas, but it's not Hamas, and we have to be very clear about that. Why do people inside Iran not show solidarity with Palestine? Well, there are two very important reasons. One of them is that the government is now extremely unpopular. This is a government that is incompetent, is corrupt, is capitalist, is neoliberal in its economic policies, and it is a government that represses opposition. Protests are arrested. Protesters are arrested, imprisoned, and so on. And in that, unfortunately, people fall into the trap of seeing the friend of their enemy, i.e. the Hamas or Palestine, as something that the Islamic Republic shouts a lot of slogans about, as not their friend, not their ally. And that's a terrible situation. I emphasize this because this is exactly the kind of anti-imperialism we don't want. The kind of anti-imperialism that Iran's Islamic Republic portrays is the worst kind of anti-imperialism. Empty slogans, radical talk, no action, create your own little group in Palestine, and then not do much about it. Even Hamas supporters have told me repeatedly that if only Iran's slogans were half of what we got in aid was half of the slogans that Iran was giving. But as a result, Iran has created an antagonism to the Palestinian movement and to Palestine in general. The other one is that these anti-slogans are themselves create fatigue. So 41 years, Iran's Islamic Republic has had formal demonstrations on the last day of Ramadan for Palestine. It's called Quds Day. And this year it didn't happen because of COVID, apparently, but this was the only year they should have really probably had. But it's a formal, it's a government organized one. People, only the supporters of the regime go. And as the supporters of the regime drop in numbers, as they become fewer and fewer, then very few of them, less and less people attend. The last few years, they haven't even broadcast it on the national TV because the numbers were down. But also it's the fatigue of, of repeating these slogans. One example, not just the burning of the flags of Israel in Tehran, is the flags they've drawn on the floor and the entrance of various main buildings. So you walk over the flag of the United States and Israel as you enter Tehran University or various campuses. There was a very unfortunate film which showed students avoiding walking over the Israeli flag. Well, when your slogans are empty, when you keep creating this ambiance that you are the harshest enemy of Israel. And when people don't see, and Palestinians say, well, we don't see much support from Iran's Islamic Republic, that's exactly what you get. People have no belief in it. There is opposition to what the claims of the Iranian government as opposed to the reality of those issues. And I think that in itself damages the cause of the Palestinians in the region and the cause of solidarity between the people. So in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we haven't seen a single demonstration. We are in the middle of a presidential election. None of the candidates have even mentioned Palestine. There is apparently a couple of tweets here and there by some of the candidates, but I have read and glanced through all their statements. There is not even a mention. In the middle of one of the most important events in the Middle East, they can't even mention the subject because they know it will make them actually unpopular. And that's the anti-imperialism of fools' comrades. That's the slogan of death to America, but then go and do a deal in secret to help them attack Iraq. That's the anti-imperialism of death to America, but let us help you with Afghan invasion. No one has any trust in that kind of language, and that damages in the long term anyone's true campaign or true efforts to fight imperialism in the region. I have said some of what I've said in Persian, on BBC Persian, partly because I'm extremely angry that at this crucial time when Gaza, when Palestine need the solidarity of the region, and especially as we have seen, for example, Jordanians moving across the border, entering the territory, the occupied territory, walking towards Gaza to show that solidarity. When we have seen on the Arab Spring, contrary to everything we've been told, week in, week out, that Arabs are not really very worried about Palestine anymore. That wasn't true. It's the reactionary Arab governments that aren't concerned about the case of Palestine. On the street in most Arab countries, there was shows of solidarity beyond anything we had experienced. And yet, in Iran, there wasn't. So in response to what I've said in Farsi, it's very interesting. The Iranian government has started a real campaign. Apparently, I don't know, but they've killed 5 Israeli generals, assassinated 5 Israeli generals in the last 5 months. Now, I know Israel is not the best democracy in the world, but if Iran's Islamic Republic had actually managed to assassinate a single general in Israel, we would have had a war. And that war would have been supported by the United States, accusing Iran of terrorist acts. So that's a complete lie. And similar other bizarre stories. They did attempt to attack, I think, somewhere in Israel, and the drones that they sent from Syria landed 35 miles away from where the destination was, and unfortunately, it could have created a nuclear incident because it wasn't far, if I'm not mistaken, from the nuclear plant in the line. Anyway. This has been, as I said, an interesting time. I totally agree with what Moshé was saying. I think we can't have these half-hearted proposals of let's go back to the arguments of 2 democratic states and so on. We are past those situations. The world situation has changed. The local situation has changed. We are facing a prison, Gaza, with 2 million people, and Bantustans reduced in size daily, weekly in other parts. And we do need to talk about the solidarity of the immediate neighbors, the Palestinian people, 6 million of them, live outside the current borders of the Islamic Republic, of Israel, the occupied territories or Gaza. We do need to make sure that we are not joining forces with those who say rockets sent from Gaza are the same as a military power attacking innocent people, isolated people. But at the same time, we must have long-term solutions, and those long-term solutions must involve the people of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. That's all I want to say. Thanks.